November is Native American Heritage Month, and of course a holiday that many celebrate as Thanksgiving. All week we take a look at people and places across Turtle Island. This is a special edition of the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
The ICT Newscast is sponsored by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, a nonprofit organization serving American Indian nations and people in the recovery and control of their rightful homelands. On the web at iltf.org.
Support for the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez comes from the Arizona PBS studios in Phoenix at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Arizona State University.
Amirawa Hopa. I am Aaliyah Chavez. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of the ICT Newscast. The harsh history of boarding schools in the United States and Canada is unresolved, and yet in recent years there has been an accounting of some of the abuses as well as the steps being taken to right the wrongs. One of those actions starts in Pennsylvania, where a repatriation process is underway for the remains of 5 children who died at the Carlile Indian Industrial School in the 1800s. For the first time, there will be ceremonies included after a historic pact was signed between 2 tribes and the U.S. Army. ICT's Stuart Huntington has the story.
The school grounds are today Army property, and previous repatriations were governed by Army protocols that banned Indigenous ceremony and held that remains be handed only to next of kin, not to tribes. 2 tribes fought those rules for 6 years. Tamara St John from the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate has been engaged from the start.
First of all, it has been a fight for sovereignty, for us as a sovereign nation to be able to take control of this process and do things the way that we know they need to be done by our protocols, our spirituality, and ultimately to bring our children home with honor.
The new agreement allows the tribes to perform any requisite ceremonies at critical junctures of the process. It also allows the remains of Amos Laframboise from the Sisseton-Wahpeton Oyate and Edward Upright from Spirit Lake to be turned over to the care of their tribes.
The Army's policy of next of kin really doesn't work. These children, like Amos, died in 1879. He does not have children and descendants. You're having to find those collateral descendants. You know, it's an overwhelming, often impossible task. So to say that the Army's policies are overly burdensome is an understatement.
The tribes will also construct a sweat lodge on the former school grounds, a development hailed by attorney Beth Wright, who helped draft the pact.
You know, when we think of boarding schools, and especially Carlile, the purpose of boarding schools was to prevent children from engaging in their traditional practices. And this is a way for the tribe to bring those practices back to their children who were prevented from having these ceremonies and these religious practices. And that's incredible.
The tribes did not get from the Army an understanding that a federal law governing Native remains known as NAGPRA and not Army rules would control future repatriations. But they were happy with the agreement even as they eyed the future.
The tribe's goals were to make this process easier for the tribes that are coming next and the tribes that will continue to request the return of their children from other boarding schools.
Our belief is that NAGPRA does apply. We do not believe that the Army should be exempt. And this is just the beginning. This is, I've said so often lately, the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many boarding schools coming.
Reporting from Carbondale, Colorado, Stuart Huntington, ICT News.
We now learn more about that repatriation effort from Tamara St John. She worked for years to get the remains of one of her tribal ancestors returned home from a cemetery at the Carlile Indian Industrial School. The road seemed headed for a dead end, but with some help from attorneys at the Native American Rights Fund, it ended in a historic pact that introduced ceremony to Carlile repatriations. St. John spoke with ICT's Stuart Huntington about the effort.
This has been a 6-year battle to try to find a means to facilitate this. The Native American Rights Fund people had been able to break through for us and build that bridge with the Army to even have the conversation to develop an agreement. Sisseton, Wahpeton, and Spirit Lake are one family. We are under the same treaty of February 19th, 1867, and our battle has been to be able to do things together in the way that we know that we need to do, with our spirituality, with our protocols, using our resources and our experts to be able to do this and bring them home. And, the ongoing conversations have been confusing. Our communication has been sporadic at best over this 6 years. And if you recall, the Army's policy of next of kin really doesn't work. It doesn't work for most people. They have resulted in this long 6 years, a 6-year wait to bring them home because we weren't able to at one point find the actual name of the father of one of them, or the fact that there are no historical records in 1879 that would name a child. It's an immense undertaking to try to meet that Army policy standard. We as a tribe have that right to be able to facilitate these things in the best interest of our families, our community, and our children. We know best. We know how to take care of our people, and to let us do these things in a way that honors our spirituality. The boarding schools were intended, and certainly Carlisle is probably the most notorious, known for to kill the Indian, save the man, that kind of mentality. And so to move that all the way to this process and to have ceremony or prayer in our language and in our ways of prayer, our spirituality, our protocols, to be able to do that right there at Carlisle, the very place that was intended to erase those things, is really a tremendous, tremendous, I think, success for us and for other tribes. One elder had said to me, these young men would have been chiefs had this not happened to them. And when you bring them home, you bring them home wrapped in buffalo robes like the chiefs that they are. And so we made that commitment to do that. And you notice in the agreement, there is not only those elements of spirituality, prayer, and protocol with our traditional societies and our spiritual practices, but also the buffalo robes, that the Army will be supplying those buffalo robes. Typically, they would do the American flag, the slow salute, transfer ceremony. And in this instance, we feel this is not their story. That is not their story, that of a soldier. We need to define the narrative and share the truth of history, the truth of who they are, and what happened there, so that our modern generations are able to understand and maybe understand where we are today. This whole story has been about everything related to education and history. And those are things that I think in many states, in many communities, we fight for those things to be able to share our history in truth in our own voices. And in this instance, instead of the military cemetery policy dictating the transfer ceremony of like a soldier, we are doing this the way that we know is best, a way that is with family love, with truth and honor.
Tamara St. John, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the work you do.
Another example of that comes from Canada, where a movement started a decade ago to commemorate the experiences of students at a single Canadian residential school. Last month, Canadians were reminded of this legacy on September 30th, which is Orange Shirt Day. It's a federal holiday in Canada focused on healing the legacy of that entire era. It's also now taking root in the United States. ICT's Stuart Huntington has more on what started as and will always be known as Orange Shirt Day.
September 30th marks the third annual National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. It highlights the history and impacts of Canada's residential school system that took Native students from their families and stripped them of their lifeways. The day, marked by marches and gatherings, is also taking root in the United States.
The importance is to really shed a light on what happened in this country because it's just not known in the general public. It's not taught about, it's just not talked about. People don't know. So taking this day to really spread awareness is important. And it also allows our community to come together and support each other as we continue to learn more about what happened in Indian boarding schools and just bring about more truth and awareness.
Last year marked a major turning point in the U.S. The Interior Department released its first federal Indian boarding school initiative report. The initiative is designed to determine the scope of the long-shrouded system.
The truth is coming out more and more, especially this past year. So the more that people are learning the truth, the more it's bringing about emotions in them. And it is about the children, and bringing remembrance of the children in ways of putting little baby shoes on the steps of churches or schools or anywhere, really, just to bring that awareness.
But much remains hidden. Since last year's report, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition has identified more than 100 more Indian boarding schools, and the trauma from the schools is difficult to measure.
You can almost tie all of our disparities or everything that we're going through as Native people back to Indian boarding schools, from low education rates, suicide rates, high poverty rates, high health disparity rates. Everything can be tied back to boarding school. It goes deeper than people can even imagine without really going into it. It's literally tied to every issue that we experience today. And we're still going through it. You can see on Native lands just the trauma that is still living within people, the intergenerational trauma, the intergenerational and historical trauma that we carry within our genes.
Just ask Tiana Bill. She went to Carlile, Pennsylvania, the site of the country's first federal boarding school. She went to bring home the remains of her Puyallup ancestor, Edward Spot, who died at the school in 1896. But the remains in the grave were not Edward's. No one knows if they will ever be located.
Don't think that just because, we're living in the 2020s that this trauma is something of the past. Because if we don't if we don't take care of ourselves right now, and if we don't address it, then it will never be done. It will follow us into our future.
Which is what Orange Shirt Day hopes to prevent.
If we start by knowing the truth, then we can start the healing process to get through this trauma and everything that was put in place to be against us as Native people.
Reporting from Carbondale, Colorado, Stuart Huntington, ICT News.
There is another boarding school story to tell, and this time this one comes from theater. Mary Katherine Nagel is an attorney and playwright. Her plays have explained complicated concepts from federal Indian law to the legal implications of climate change. This summer, she took on an even greater challenge. That is, writing about her family, and in case that wasn't enough, as the actor in a one-woman play. ICT's Mark Trahant talked with Mary Katherine and her husband, Jonadev Chowri. Here they talk about the play The Far End, the story of Jean Hill Chowri.
I never met my mother-in-law, Jean Hill Chowri, but I've read her plays. I've read her poems that she wrote on the back of McDonald's receipts, the letters she wrote to Congress, the newspaper clippings that recount her incredible life, her handwritten notes in the margins of Supreme Court decisions.
There is a bit of autobiography in every work of fiction or nonfiction. We add a story, a memory, a reminder of a path. Then there could be a twist. How about this? A play about a playwright who happens to be your mother-in-law, telling a story that is both intimate and universal.
Well, Jonadev asked me why I wrote plays about pretty much every other tribal nation that exists except Muskogee Nation. And I said, well, I'm happy to write a play about Muskogee Nation. What play should that be? And he said, I think you should write a story about my mom.
That's not true. It was your idea to do about Mom.
Well, okay.
I was like,
I guess that's
time
true.
to write a
Okay,
story
that's true.
about a foundational global civilization. And you're like, that's right.
That's right.
It's
So
about
initially the
Muskogee
debate
Nation.
was why my plays were about other tribal nations and not Muskogee Nation. And I kept telling him, well, you're going to have to tell me what to write about. And I was researching Chitoharjo and other, really famous Muskogee leaders of Bofiahola. And actually then his father passed away, and we were going through his father's house. And that's when we found the book that your dad wrote about your mom. Mm-hmm. And it's a really phenomenal 110-page handwritten story about her life. And reading that, that's when I knew I wanted to write a play about her life. Writing's very intimate, and I got to know her by reading her writing and then writing her story, but then also speaking her words on stage is a whole other level of intimacy, and acting it out is just something I never imagined I would do, but it's been an incredible experience.
Of course, I knew Mom in a very different way than most people knew her. I knew her as my mom, and so always appreciated and understood the work she did, but I think anybody who has a mom, which is most of us, can relate to how daunting it is to hear that we're going to be putting her life story on display for other people. But beyond that, we had talked a little bit about doing a story that provides a roadmap to young people to engage in activism in a meaningful way. And there are a lot of roadmaps that are out there. There's not one roadmap. But I have always thought of Mom's life being a roadmap for meaningful activism balanced with being a good mom and a good sister and a good daughter. And she never put her work ahead of the family. And I always appreciated that as a son. So having her story told was important to me, not just in terms of being Muskogee Creek or not just in terms of wanting there to be a good roadmap for activism, but so many folks who work in activism have these life balances that they have to navigate. And I thought Mom's story would be, you know, very informative to people who are kind of struggling with some of the decisions that have to be made. So I always tell people, yeah, Mom did some amazing things in her work and in her activism, but most importantly, she was a wonderful mom. I think one of the major takeaways from the play, and there's so many beautiful themes in it, is that the advances that our generation may be celebrating today are made possible by the work of all of our ancestors and the struggles of so many folks whose names we know, but so many more whose names we don't, to make these advances possible. So they talk about some of the play talks about the McGirt decision and the historic importance of it, but it also places McGirt in a long continuum of struggle that predates removal to Oklahoma and extends to the modern day, even past McGirt.
And one of those modern stories involves the Phoenix Indian School.
They're going to sell the school to a developer. Like the school I was forced to go to, native kids in Arizona were taken forcibly from their homes and sent to the Phoenix Indian School, where they were beaten if they did not speak English. Many celebrated the news that they wanted to close the school on the 100th year anniversary of its opening, but the motivation for the closure was hardly a reckoning with the sins of the past. And let me tell you, it was war. We were up against a major Florida land corporation, the Collier Group. They were interested in a complex land swap whereby they would give up surface rights to swampland in South Florida that they cheaply acquired many decades ago. In exchange, the federal government would hand over the Phoenix Indian School property to the Colliers so they could build fancy multi-million-dollar rich whatevers for rich people to live and work in. We disagree that these 73 acres of land should be commodified, developed. We want the property to be a park, a cultural center, the headquarters for a Native nonprofit that can provide community service to the Native population here in Phoenix. We won. The elders were thrilled, the community celebrated.
What I loved most about the play, I think it's perseverance and the boarding school experience that Mom lived through that helped, that didn't destroy her, but helped shape her activism. To me, that was kind of my favorite part, the fact that it wasn't until long after she died that I knew how many times she ran away from boarding school. She ran away 8 times and only got away the 8th time. I'd heard bits and pieces from Mom when she'd share about her experience, but like most folks who had difficult boarding school experiences, and not everybody had, the boarding school experience isn't uniform, but when Mom would share little snippets of the difficulties she had, she would just share small snippets. And so I didn't really realize how deep the struggle was just to get away from that school until we started going back through some of those original source documents and to see what Mom became despite those challenges. That was my favorite part, the boarding school period. Mom passed away in '97. The bulk of the effort to preserve the land as public land was achieved in her lifetime. But that was only half of what Mom and other folks in the grassroots community were fighting for. Unfortunately, the second half didn't fully get to be achieved. And the dream of many of the folks who were part of the Native American Heritage Preservation Coalition was to not just preserve the land for public use, but really to have the land be a native services hub where there could be cultural programming, healthcare provided, a whole litany of social services provided. That part never fully happened. We got close. Many of the nonprofits in the Valley set up shop and joined forces next door. but to really kind of recount the property's place in history as a place of survival and rebirth. The idea was that it would be kind of a native embassy for the community that built that property. And so, yeah, it's a huge part of the story, but to really kind of recount the property's place in history as a place of survival and rebirth, the idea was that it would be kind of a native embassy for the community that built that property. And so, yeah, it's a huge part of the story of the Valley, but also a huge part of the Indian school story. But just knowing where Mom's heart was, I get sad that more didn't happen.
In Phoenix, Arizona, Mark Trahant, ICT News.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.